me just briefly introduce ourselves so you know who we are. I'm Greg Stapleton. I'm the Education Manager at the Times Union.
My name is Debbie Silvers. I'm a second-year law student here at Illinois.
And I'm Joe Connors, professor here at the law school. I'll start maybe by reading the question.
If I could just interject for a second. Good morning, Your Honors. My name is Justin Smith, and along with my colleagues Riley O'Brien and Rebecca Ryby, we will be presenting for Team Jefferson today.
Great, thank you. The question is, quote, free speech is a condition of legitimate government. Laws and policies are not legitimate unless they have been adopted through a democratic process, and a process is not democratic if government has prevented anyone from expressing his convictions about what those laws and policies should be. End of quote. Do you agree or disagree with this assertion? Why? And specifically, how can Americans most effectively express their convictions about what laws and policies should be? And what limits, if any, should a democratic government be permitted to place on freedom of expression?
Thank you. I agree with this statement because legitimate government is, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. The foundation of our constitutionalism is that the government gets its power to rule from the people. Thomas Hobbes first developed this theory in the Leviathan. He proposed a social contract, an agreement between the people and a ruler, in which the people give up some rights in order to gain the security that government provides. The first words of the preamble of the Constitution, "We the people," reflect the belief that our government's legitimacy comes from the approval of the people. The fundamental democratic principle of popular sovereignty also supports the idea that it is essential to ensure that people's voices are being heard and the majority will of the people is in support of proposed legislation. To ensure that a tyranny of the majority does not form, it is particularly important to ensure that the minority in any issue is fully capable of voicing their viewpoints. If government limits the people's ability to participate in government through free expression, then the government is not operating with the approval of the people and should not have the right to rule.
The simplest way to participate in government is to vote in elections for candidates who represent your interests. However, other methods, such as writing to congressmen and senators, public demonstrations, writing to a newspaper, volunteering on campaigns, and participating in public protests are available. All of these methods are protected under the rights of freedom of speech, the freedom to assemble, freedom of the press, and the implied right of association. An example of participatory government today, which falls under the category of freedom of assembly, would be the Tea Party protests. The Tea Party protests are a series of nationally coordinated protests across the United States, with the most recent being in September of 2009. The events are in protest of big government, the current healthcare reform bill, the federal budget, and the stimulus package, which the protesters argue is an example of wasteful spending and unnecessary government growth. This is a prime example of how anyone is able to participate in their local, state, or federal government and have their voice be heard.
Freedom of speech, however, is not an absolute right. The Supreme Court has ruled that government does have the ability to restrict Americans' freedom of speech in certain instances. Obscenity, defamation, fighting words, commercial speech, speech in public places, and speech which carries the threat of imminent violence are the types of speech which the government can restrain. Obscenity is governed by a three-pronged test established in the 1973 Supreme Court case Miller v. California. Defamation law in the United States stems mainly from the colonial trial of publisher Peter Zenger, in which truth was established as a complete defense to a defamation charge. However, false and damaging statements are still subject to civil lawsuits. In the 1942 case, Chaplinsky v. New Hampshire, the Supreme Court ruled that fighting words such as insults shouted to a man on the street do not enjoy the First Amendment's protection. Also in 1942, the Supreme Court ruled in Valentine v. Christensen that the government can impose restrictions on commercial speech. The Supreme Court has ruled several times on the issue of speech in special places. For example, the well-known case of Tinker v. Des Moines, handed down in 1969, permitted free speech in public schools, but subsequent decisions in Bethel School District v. Fraser and Hazelwood v. Kuhlmeyer limited the application of the Tinker case. Finally, the government also has the power to restrict speech which is likely to cause imminent violence. supported by the Supreme Court's rulings in Brandenburg v. Ohio and Schenck v. United States. I believe that the current restrictions placed on free speech are sufficient to cover any foreseeable situations, and there are no limits which I believe to be excessive or unnecessary in government infringement of freedom of rights.
Time. Some follow-up questions.
How is increased use of the internet affecting freedom of expression, both positively and negatively?
I believe that increased use of the internet has influenced freedom of expression in a very positive light, because whereas back when freedom of speech was first developed in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was composed, we did not have all this technology. And if you wanted to get information about candidates that were running for office or public policy issues, it was very difficult. I mean, either through word of mouth or newspapers. But now with the internet, you have information that is readily available for people to gain insight, and especially when it comes to electing public officials, then you have a more knowledgeable vote of who you are electing.
I would like to respectfully disagree with my colleague. I think that the internet is also affecting free speech and expression in a way that can be damaging to society. If we look at some of the more recent events that have happened, we can see that some of these terrorists, such as Yudal Ali Kassan in Fort Hood and the shooter last year at the Holocaust Museum, have been spreading very hateful speech that sometimes does incite violent acts to occur within the country. So I believe that the internet can also be used as a way to spread violence.
And so then, based on that thought and your thought as well, what role does government have in limiting freedom of expression and freedom of speech on the internet?
I believe that the problem with the government trying to regulate freedom of speech on the internet is that imposing one regulation on freedom of speech means that the government can then choose to take another step to regulate that. And this is why I believe the government, to this point, has not been able to regulate the internet and people's use of it. The issue here, I guess, is that the government would like to regulate it because there are some things that the government would like to see done with it. However, the people's right to freedom of speech does seem to take precedent over government regulation here, in my mind at least, because the people's interest in spreading free thought it outweighs the government's interest in prohibiting speech that it does not agree with. I would point to Iran's blocking of people's Facebook pages during the recent protests held during the summer and into the fall and winter as evidence of what can happen when the government is allowed to regulate the people's use of the internet.
And what about I'm sorry, I'm just going to ask one more follow-up question. What about the flip side of that? Not necessarily regulating the ability to disseminate information through the internet, but the ability to accept information either through social networking sites or through the internet, correct?
I believe that for the most part is the people's choice whether or not to accept information. For example, by going to a certain website, you are choosing to accept whatever information is given to you by that website. And therefore, I don't believe that the government should be able to impose restrictions on this. It is the people's free choice to go to a certain website in search of a certain piece of information, if you will. And for the government to restrict that, I believe, would be extremely unnecessary and an abuse of government power.
I'd like to sort of shift about the limits on free speech in terms of hate speech. For example, locally here in Albany, a group of high school students put on a play about Matthew Shepard, a college student who was lynched because he was gay. And an out-of-town group was protesting across the street, yelling a lot of anti-gay comments towards the high school actors. These were adults yelling at students. Should that type of speech be protected by the First Amendment?
I believe that any type of speech such as that can be offensive to somebody, it should be protected by the First Amendment unless it crosses the border that it begins to incite violence. If you have a case where people are uttering such either obscenities or hate words that are going on to incite a violent reaction, then I believe that it's the government's duty duty to protect those who could be involved in such violence and then to restrict that speech.
So then do you agree with your colleague when he said that the internet should not be regulated at all back then?
I believe that while the government should not regulate the internet, because I believe it would personally be extremely difficult for the government to regulate the internet, I do believe that, as my colleague stated, it is a person's choice to go on the internet and to look up information, whereas a public riot outside at a school, people do not have as much protection from that riot as they do from choosing what they read on the internet.
Since we have a minute, I'm going to ask a question that is somewhat outside the general scope of the conversation. But all three of you are high school students, and all three of you deal with government regulation of your ability to view an internet site every day in your school, theoretically. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on schools' ability to limit your access to Facebook, social media, or even cell phones and text messaging?
I believe that it is completely unfortunate that schools use website blocking programs, because a school is a place where you are there to learn and to expand your horizons. And I believe that by blocking social websites and even many informational websites that could just have something on it that the school doesn't see fit to be an education center, I do believe that it should not be regulated in schools as far as the internet goes.
Any last comments on that outside of the judging realm? I'd be interested in just hearing your thoughts.
I'm actually going to respectfully disagree with my colleague. I believe that because a school is considered a special place by the Supreme Court, there is definitely a constitutional basis for saying that the government can limit what people can and cannot view in their schools on the internet. There are certain things such as pornography and social networking sites which bring no educational value to the school system, and to restrict students' access to such sites or to eliminate it altogether through the use of website blockers makes total sense to me, because students should not be viewing those sites in their schools when they're supposed to be furthering their education and not working on their social skills. Well, not necessarily working on social skills in that sense, but not necessarily social networking, I guess.
Sort of, I would draw a line between both of these stands and say that there are some things that they should be able to block, but I think that currently a lot of the filters and stuff they use, at least I know in my school, can block out websites that you can actually gain knowledge from. Like some news sites you can access and others you can't. I don't know how they decide, but I feel like it's blocking out the full perspective of the world, because everybody has a different view on things, and if you're not seeing everybody's view, I don't think you're truly being educated.
Thank you. Thank you for indulging us with a couple of extra minutes of just thought-provoking conversation.
Comments from the judges, please?
Sure. Generally, I was really impressed as a law school professor. I think all three of you have potential future careers as lawyers, so give me a call if you're interested in learning more about law school. I like the way that you organized your presentation with giving historical background, Riley giving some specific examples, Justin talking about limits that really tied in together really nicely. I also like the way that you presented different opinions on a single question. That the essence of open dialogue is can be different views. And I like your ability to mention some current events. Response to questions.
I think I echo what he's saying. You guys did really well. We like current events, and well, he said he is Justin. I have one just his piece of advice. I've done these competitions in law school, and I know what I'm going to say is hard, but try to relax a little bit more. I know it's really hard, but as you get more comfortable with what you're trying to say, just relax a little bit more. But overall, you guys did really well.
As I mentioned at the beginning, I work at the newspaper, so I'm really